Let's go over a few common mistakes that tend to come up whenever we start combining clauses into relationships. The mistakes that we're going to go over here all have to do with the same thing. They're all about the same thing. These mistakes happen when writers aren't paying attention to the structure beneath their sentences. And these mistakes are so common that the cognitive scientist Steven Pinker says that a few of these common errors are so uncontroversial that they become tantamount to the confession, "I am illiterate," and no writer should be caught making them. In other words, if your reader comes across any of these three errors, then they're instantly going to think, okay, like this isn't a very serious writer. This is such a common mistake and they're not catching it. So you really want to get clear on these three things. But as I say, they all have to do with the same problem. They all occur whenever writers aren't paying attention to the underlying structure of the sentence. Whenever you are reading and writing, I always want you to remember these two structures. If we go back to the lecture on grammar machines, we said that, inside the grammar machine, we basically take these words and we arrange them into one of these two structures. So you're going to need to use this to analyze your own writing. The first common mistake is about parallel structure, and I'm not going to tell you what's wrong with it just yet. I'm just going to show you an example of these common mistakes and see if you pick up on it. So in this case, we have a parallel structure. In the sentence, it says, gravitation is a long-range interaction that attracts atoms smoothly, consistently, and without noise. What's wrong with that? This next one, we call it a run-on sentence or a comma splice. Okay, so what's happening here? The teacher explained the lesson. The students played with their classmates. What's wrong with that sentence? Here's another run-on sentence. We have, your lecture is scheduled for 5 p.m. However, it is preceded by a meeting. And the last one is called a sentence fragment. So we say, atom number 8 is called oxygen, period, because the chemical properties depend upon the number of electrons on the outside, period. What's wrong with that? Well, maybe you caught it, but in the case of parallel structure, we know that whenever we're giving a list of 2 or more items, the items in that list need to be grammatically parallel. In other words, they need to be from the same part of speech. The list, if it's going to be nouns, all the units in that list must be nouns. If they're going to be verbs, fine. Phrases, clauses, doesn't matter. The point is that every member in that list is from the same part of speech. So if we look at the list here, we have an important consideration in orthopedic surgery and how to implant prosthesis is the possibility of infection. So if we look at the noun phrase structure up here, this is going to be in the subject position. So we have an important consideration in orthopedic surgery and how to implant prosthesis. We have and, so we have 2 items in this list, but we see they're not grammatically parallel. Orthopedic surgery is a noun phrase, and how to implant prosthesis is a noun clause. We'll deal with noun clauses later, but it's really easy to see here that one of them has a verb in it, and the other one is just a simple noun phrase. So in order to correct this, we need to make sure that both items in the list are from the same part of speech. So we have an important consideration in orthopedic surgery and prosthesis implants. We've gone from how to implant prosthesis. We've decided, okay, what's the head noun there? Prosthesis or implant? Probably implant. How to implant what? How to implant prosthesis. So we're going to say the head noun is going to be implant, and we're going to modify that noun with prostheses. So it becomes the singular, and implant, the head noun, takes the plural, so it becomes and prosthesis implants. An important consideration in those two things is the possibility of infection. Looking at the first example, we have gravitation is a long-range interaction that attracts atoms smoothly, consistently, and without noise. So smoothly and consistently, those are adverbs. We need without noise to be an adverb. It's not as simple as just changing the words around. We need to find an adverb that means exactly the same thing. You probably know it. it's quietly, so we can just replace that with quietly. But in some cases, you're going to need to use a thesaurus in order to find a word that means exactly the same thing as the phrase that you're trying to replace. The second mistake that we looked at is the comma splice, or the run-on sentence. So here's the example. It said, the teacher explained the lesson, the students played with their classmates. What's wrong here? Well, the problem here is that a comma cannot join two independent clauses. If you go back to the lesson we did on punctuation, you might remember that. A comma has no grammatical powers at all. A comma is basically just a pause in speaking. So you cannot join two independent clauses with a comma. All a comma does is kind of put up a yellow light and tell the reader, hey, slow down, there's a change coming. So we cannot join two independent clauses with a comma. That's called a comma splice. Similarly, but slightly different, we have two clauses joined in the same sentence by a sentence connector, the adverb however. Also a mistake. So your lecture is scheduled for 5 p.m. However, it is preceded by a meeting. Sentence adverbs like however and therefore and that kind of thing, they're not connectors. Basically, when you use one of these adverbs, it is substituting the previous sentence. It's not a connector. It's a transitional phrase that shows the reader the relationship between these two sentences. So it's not a connector, and this is a faulty connection. It becomes a run-on sentence where we have two independent clauses that are not joined by any syntax, any connector or conjunction. So how do we fix these? Well, in the case of the comma splice or the run-on sentence, there are basically three things that we can do. In the first case, you can just add a conjunction. So that could be and, or that could be before if you want to turn it into a dependent clause. You can use a subordinating conjunction. But a connecting word, a conjunction, is something that will join the two clauses into a relationship. So we can have the teacher explained the lesson and the students played with their classmates. Or it could be the teacher explained the lesson while the students played with their classmates. It all depends on what kind of a relationship you want the two clauses to have. Another way that you could do it is to change the comma to a semicolon. A semicolon is a way of joining two independent clauses. If we use only a semicolon, we're telling the reader like, okay, these two independent clauses have some relationship, but maybe it's so obvious that I'm just not even going to mention it. If you want to tell the reader what kind of a relationship they have, you'll use an adverb like however or meanwhile, but the adverb is optional. The point is that the semicolon is able to join the two clauses into a relationship. The adverb is optional, but a comma can't do that. So we have the teacher explained the lesson, semicolon, meanwhile, the students played with their classmates. And the last way, of course, is to just turn them into two sentences, two simple sentences. And in the last case, what we have is a fragment. So a fragment means that it's not actually a finite clause. It doesn't mean anything. In this case, we have a independent clause. So that would have been chemical properties depend upon the number of electrons on the outside. However, it is attached to the subordinating conjunction because, and when you take a finite clause and you attach it to a subordinating conjunction, it is no longer a finite clause, it's no longer an independent clause, it becomes a dependent clause. And dependent clauses cannot stand on their own. They must be joined in a sentence to an independent clause. We see this a lot with Korean writers because there is a sentence structure that ends with the verb demun에, because that's fine because the Korean language has topic marking particles, and so you can just announce a topic at the top of the page, and then everything after that is going to refer back to that topic. English does not have topic marking particles, so we cannot have dependent clauses in their own sentences. A dependent clause doesn't mean anything on its own. It must be joined in the same sentence as an independent clause. An independent clause is a noun phrase subject and a finite verb. So we can fix that mistake by taking the dependent clause and just bringing it into the same sentence. It becomes atom number 8 is called oxygen because the chemical properties depend upon the number of electrons on the outside. Just a quick tip here, there are a few prepositions that are often confused for conjunctions. So let's take a look at these. As we know, prepositions always attach to nouns, whereas conjunctions always attach to clauses. So here we have a common mistake. Despite there are advances in drug therapies, depression continues to devastate countless lives. Despite is not a conjunction, it is a preposition, so therefore we need to take the information in there and turn it into a noun. There are advances in drug therapies. So to convert that into a noun, we would have to say something like, despite advances in drug therapies, despite those advances, depression continues to devastate countless lives. Another common mistake is mistaking the prepositional phrase such as for the adverbial phrases, for example, or for instance. So adverbs can introduce a finite clause. You can say, for example, people sleep with mosquito nets, right? But the phrase such as is a preposition, and prepositions cannot attach to finite clauses. They always attach to nouns. So here's a common mistake. Abe's team has collected data on health-related choices, such as, do people sleep with mosquito nets? That highlighted section, do people sleep with mosquito nets? That is a finite clause. It's an interrogative. It's asking a question. So we need to switch that into a noun form. And that becomes the noun clause whether, which again we'll deal with in another lecture. But the point is that such as cannot attach to finite clauses. It must attach to nouns. Here's the same mistake in a different way. Again, this writer is mistaking the prepositional phrase such as for the adverbial phrases, for example, and for instance. So you can imagine this saying, for example, we can modify and strengthen our immune system, but you cannot say such as we can modify and strengthen our immune system, because such as is a prepositional phrase which must attach to a noun. So identifying these mutations has opened up new avenues to attack cancer, period, such as we can modify and strengthen our immune system. That becomes new avenues to attack cancer, such as modifying and strengthening. So we've taken that finite clause, we can modify and strengthen, and we've converted the verbs there into non-finite ing clauses, basically nouns. So we can say such as modifying and strengthening our immune system. So let's play with this a little bit. Here are two clauses. Join them together using the phrase that's in parenthesis there. So we have such as. You're going to join these two clauses using the phrase such as. Okay, we have such as here. This is about Feynman. So we have such as, and we know that such as is a preposition, a prepositional phrase. It only attaches to nouns, but here we have a finite clause. So simply, we just need to change this finite clause into a non-finite clause. So we're going to remove the subject, switch the verb to an ing, that means taking the tense out of it, and switching it to a non-finite noun clause. Remove the period, and we get the Caltech professors who assisted Feynman would handle mundane details, such as making up homework problems. In this one, we're going to make a non-restrictive relative clause. So you're going to look at these and join them using the relative pronoun which. Which, that's a relative pronoun, so we are going to make a non-restrictive relative clause with this. So what are we going to replace with the relative pronoun? Another tremendous amalgamation, that means joining together of many things. Another tremendous amalgamation was the discovery of the relation between electricity, magnetism, and light. Today we call them the electromagnetic field. Okay, so these three things, the relation between them, that relationship between these three things, we call it the electromagnetic field. So those three things, that's going to be our relative pronoun. We put which here, but we know that the relative pronoun always floats to the head. So we get a non-restrictive relative clause that says, which today we call the electromagnetic field. And in this case, we're going to join these two independent clauses using the adverb however. Okay, we've got however here. Prior to the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, much of civilization was in poverty and misery. However, our understanding of Newton's mechanics and the steam engine created wealth and prosperity in society. Well, this is quite fine, and really, you could put however at the beginning of this sentence. I think you're very used to that. But you know what I notice here? I think this is a very heavy sentence. And so if we want to keep a parallel structure, like let's see what these sentences are made out of. Let's break them up. Prior to this time. So we introduce this clause with a prepositional phrase prior to this thing. And then we have a subject, verb, and then a subject complement here, in poverty and misery. Now look at the structure of the next clause. We have a long subject here, our understanding of what? Of Newton's mechanics and the steam engine. That understanding created wealth and prosperity. So I think it's going to be like easier to process if we take this however and we kind of break it up. If we put however in the middle, what we have is a nice alignment, a nice parallel structure between these two long phrases at the beginning. Prior to the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, much of civilization was in poverty and misery. Our understanding of Newton's mechanics and the steam engine, however, created wealth and prosperity in society. It just makes the sentence a little bit easier to process if we put the sentence connector not at the beginning, but in between the subject and the verb. Slightly differently here, what you're going to do is just take a look at this sentence and fix the error. What's wrong with this sentence? Okay, what's wrong with this? Graphene sheets tend to pull into alignment with each other and deforming easily. Okay, so we have and here, so we know that whenever there are two or more items in a list, that those items need to be grammatically identical. They need to be from the same part of speech. So what are these parts of speech? What's the verb here? It's the verb phrase. They tend to. So what do they tend to do? Well, they tend to pull. So that's the infinitive form of the verb, to pull. They tend to do that. And they tend to deform, easily deform. So the graphene sheets tend to pull into alignment with each other and to deform easily or just deform easily. Last one, there is a mistake in this sentence. So see if you can spot it and how would you fix it? What's wrong with this one? What's wrong with this one? Very small positive experiences can make people not only feel better, but also are more helpful to others. So here again, we have a coordination, but it's not just a coordinating conjunction, fanboys, but it's this correlative conjunction. So that's the kind that has two parts, not only this, but also that. Either this or that kind of thing. So it can make people not only, but also. So these two items need to be from the same part of speech. It makes people feel better. Make you feel, make somebody feel, make people feel. That's a ditransitive verb. So similarly, on the other side here, we need another ditransitive verb. It makes people feel better and it makes people what? Are more helpful to others. So in this case, we need not the finite verb here, are, but we need the non-finite be. It makes people not only feel better, but also be more helpful to others.